Won't you want to say system of metaphor?
Yeah. But I wouldn't have thought about it.
Oh.
Sorry, yes. Yeah, I was the victim of metaphor.
Because I couldn't help thinking that in itself is a metaphor.
Of course.
System of metaphor, and I went, you can't talk without metaphor.
Right.
So, nobody asked me.
I wasn't saying metaphors are we have to use metaphors. Sometimes they lead us astray.
Of course they do.
I was under the impression that George was actually because the Democrats were wiped out so bad and she stopped it. I will think this stuff.
What was that?
Oh, George Latham wrote a whole bunch of stuff about how we use metaphor as a basis of language. There are very strong voice and op-eds and tweets about the way Trump uses language to deceive.
Wow.
Well,
What he says today.
There's that too. Yeah. But the way he whips out the friends
Oh, he's very good. Because he can do it in nice. But then the next day he reverses it. I forgot to say wouldn't instead of couldn't.
Sure.
Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting soon, but in the meantime, does anyone have a clicker by any chance? It would be welcome. Anyone have a clicker that I could borrow? Yeah, a clicker for the computer. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's an Australian skill. I think it's an Australian skill because of our facetious attitude. I think that gets us undone.
Yeah.
Because, I do. I'm sure that my supervisor and I think it's interesting.
Well, yeah, we need to be careful that's more sensitive.
It's interesting. No, I love different attitudes of language. While people are arriving, just a few reminders. We'll have a job fair today at 12:15 in Venus and Mars, those rooms in the middle. So if you have jobs to offer, you have a nice company that needs ALIFers, or if you're an ALIFer, you're looking for jobs, that's the place you want to go to. So at 12:15 during lunch. Also, we have a social activity tonight. Will be indoor bouldering. There will be just an hour, departing from here, an hour after the end of the conference. I'll announce that again. and it will be in Shinagawa. The dates will be online. Also, don't forget to vote for posters. If you liked some work, one of those posters, just vote for them. You have 2 votes. Be too bad not to use them.
Before start the keynote speech, I just want to remind you that we are receiving the question on the Slido. So if you have any questions, please go to the Slido website. Okay, good morning. Let's start the fifth keynote speech. I'm Hiro Izuka from Hokkaido University, Japan. It's a great honor to introduce Dr. Elena Antonova for the fifth keynote speech of ALIFE conference. Dr. Elena Antonova is a lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, King's College London, UK. She has obtained a PhD in the cognitive psychology from the Institute of Psychiatry, UK in 2004. Her main research interest is the neuroscience of mindfulness using psychophysiology and neuroimaging methods with application to the prevention and management of psychosis and schizophrenia. Dr. Antonova had Templeton Positive Neuroscience Award between 2011 to 2013 for the project investigating the effect of mindful attention on sensory information processing in expert mindfulness practitioners. She has been actively involved with the Mind and Life Institute, an organization founded by Francisco Barrera that aims to facilitate an interdisciplinary research into the effects of contemplative practices, and has been elected as the Mind and Life Research Fellow in November 2017. And actually, the Mind and Life Institute was founded by the Francisco Barrera. And also the first ECO was also founded by Francisco Barrera and Paul Bourgin. And then ECO is ending and they united to the new Actual Life conferences. And I think it's a very good time for us to discuss about the Francisco Barrera with Dr. Elena Antonova. So please welcome Dr. Elena Antonova.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me. It's a real joy to be an observer and a participant in such an interdisciplinary and open-minded gathering. Before I begin, just to help me to gauge how much detail to go into on various aspects of my talk, would you be kind to give me a show of hands? How many people know of Francisco Barrera? How many people know of autopoiesis? Inaction, neurophenomenology. Okay, good, as I expected. Thank you very much. I always appreciate when the keynote speaker or any speaker at the conference gives a little bit of insight into their formative childhood experiences that seem to give us an idea of why they followed a certain path in their professional life. So I really appreciate it when Ken gave us a bit of insight into his journey. I decided to follow the suit. I didn't have a cute picture of myself as a child at hand, so I have this turtle instead. And one of the things that I consistently did as a child is changing my point of view physically. I hardly ever worked on the ground. I was climbing trees and hanging down. And it was absolutely fascinating to me how things changed if I changed my perspective. So as I go along with this talk, even if it's not usually your cup of tea, I would invite you to kind of, in a spirit of open-mindedness, to do a few experiential rotations with me and see where it goes. For the overview of what I'm going to do, so very briefly I'm going to trace the evolution of Barrera's thought from autopoiesis to neurophenomenology. I'm going to unpack in a little bit more detail the radicality of neurophenomenology when it comes to ontological position that Barrera took on that. I'm going to briefly sketch some of the findings from contemplative neuroscience that I think could be useful for AR, should I say, ALIFE robotics to think moving forward. So Francisco started off as a biologist, and then later in his life he migrated to cognitive neuroscience. His reading was incredibly eclectic, from second-order cybernetics to constructivism to analytical philosophy, phenomenology, Sufism, and Buddhism. And when Francisco was following his education in Buddhist tradition, he wasn't treating it as a religion. He wasn't taking anything in faith value. Buddhism for him was a system of philosophical study, a praxis method for the discipline investigation of the mind, for the first-person examination of lived experience. And that's influenced his work, particularly later in his life, quite a bit in terms of developing various methods for the study of consciousness. So when I speak of Buddhism, it has the same kind of application to my personal and professional life. So his outreach in terms of his legacies is incredibly broad, from biology to second-order cybernetics, calculus of self-reference, autonomous system immunology, cognitive science, development of first-person methods to enrich consciousness studies. And he set up contemplative neuroscience, the field I'm engaged in, and as Hiro already mentioned, he set up Mind and Life Institute, which was started off as the very small conferences between the Dalai Lama and Western scientists, first physicists and neuroscientists, to see how the rigorous systematic investigation of first-person experience through meditative practices, contemplative practices, can shed light on neural dynamics and dynamics throughout the body. The main question that preoccupied him is, what is life? And in answering this question, he started with a theoretical reflection on natural systems, and so autopoiesis was born. Autopoiesis from Greek meaning self, and poiesis meaning production or creation, doesn't just mean a system that reproduces and maintains itself in its physical boundary, as given an example here with a living cell undergoing the process of mitosis. Autopoiesis entails the emergence of the self, and with it the world, through the process of sense-making, driven by the reactions of the organism in terms of attraction and repulsion to the aspects of the environment that have valence or meaning in terms of the organism's continuous survival. To be alive is to make sense of the environment. In biological inaction, mind and life are inseparable and co-real. World is not pre-existent and predetermined with some fixed features, but continuously enacted through the embodied activity of the organism. Mind cannot be reduced to specific brain regions, but is coextensive with the relational body dynamics of the organism and the world. The sensory-motor sense-making habits of autopoietic organisms are shaped and constrained by the biological processes, such as neural, which are in turn reinforced by the sense-making habits. So there's a recursive loop there going on. So like the Ouroboros that continuously consumes itself, a living system continuously creates and recreates its reality, for better or worse. There's an interesting parallel here with Buddhism. I don't necessarily think we're well intended, it's sort of my conjecture, that autopoiesis is a biological description of the creation and maintenance of the species-specific and individual karmic patterns that structure one's view of reality, with the strongest habit of all, a perceptual structure of self and other. The perceptual habit, which serves as a useful functional purpose of biological survival, becomes reified into I and the world, me and other. At which point we're not just enacting our world, we are evading it. According to Buddhism, this process of reification, Buddhists use the term grasping, or fixation in our sort of neuroscience talk, on the aspects of our experience, is the root of all evil, or ignorance, as Buddhists would put it. So briefly acknowledging the elephant in the room, the question of sentience, well, we don't really know what happens on the level of elementary particles. We don't know what happens for simple organisms like a bacterium or a cell, but we know for us humans the strong habit of reifying things, of categorizing, labeling them, and seeing them as distinct objects is all pervasive, unless we practice some sort of kind of transformative, conscious, or take drugs, practice that allows us to kind of experience the continuity of mind without these rigid distinctions. So for now, I will leave the possibility of experiential awareness open for other natural and artificial organisms. So what I'm going to say next applies to our human experience. So this reification of subject and object leads to what is familiar to us, this naive, realist perception of the world. There are objects out there that obey the laws of physics and retain their properties whether we are there to perceive them or not. and that our senses provide us with the direct perception of the objects as they really are. With some education, by perhaps reading Immanuel Kant, we can revise this view into a more subtle one, that we never know the things as they are, things in themselves. We only have internal representations of them, structured by various innate a priori perceptual categories, and for neuroscientists by the sort of structure of our nervous system. But in this view, there are still things out there hitting our senses in various ways, according to the laws of physics. The shortcomings of representationalism are articulated in detail in the Tree of Knowledge by Maturana and Varela. In short, the so-called objects experienced by the subject are not representations of some feature of the environment, but the patterns of neural firing, the perturbations of the organism itself. In the surface of things, this sounds like an old good-fashioned materialist statement reducing subjective experience to neural processes. However, not in case of Varela, and he articulates this explicitly in his later work and turns the tables completely. In the embodied mind, this sort of hidden message comes into evident one, and this book is co-authored with Evan Thompson and Eleanor Roche. And it starts off by critiquing cognitivism or representationalism as well as connectionism, because both suffer from disembodied abstractions. As an alternative, enactive approaches proposed combining cognitive science, phenomenology, sort of continental tradition of mainly Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, and Madhyamika philosophy, so philosophy of middle way in Buddhism. In an active approach, cognition is grounded in sensory-motor dynamics, interaction between the living organism and environment. It was well received in AI, and there are some people who are working with an active approach. It views the mind as an embodied dynamic system bringing forth the world, so we see the echo of autopoiesis here. But its subtle message often gets lost in the reading. So it's really the essence of an action is it's the aim to overcome pervasive dichotomies in our language and how we apply this language to our scientific pursuits. The dichotomies of mind and body, self and other, organism and environment. And this non-dual essence of inaction, as originally formulated by Varela, is lost in most current interpretations of it and formulations of what became known as enactivism. On more detailed articulation of the difference between the two, I would recommend a paper by Sebastian Boris and Michel Bitbol. But I would just briefly say that without capturing this more subtle message of inaction as intended by Varela and his colleagues, it really renders us completely innocuous. You know, we're back into representationalism and sometimes into naive realism. So it completely makes it flat. So Varela's non-dual concerns are both ontological and epistemological. And his offer of neurophenomenology is often constrained to a contribution of kind of epistemological method, such as back and forth circulation between scientific research of the mind and disciplined phenomenologist study of lived experience. In other words, let's study meditators with their first-person methods, figure out what happens in terms of the subjective dynamics of consciousness, and pair that up with some third-person neural data or psychophysiological data. And that's what usually neurophenomenology is thought to be limited to. So I will give you a sort of a radical aspect of neurophenomenology in what follows. To remind you of the heart problem, as put by David Chalmers in 1995, which is the challenge of closing the explanatory gap between phenomenal experiences, or qualia, and the physical processes. So Francisco, in his paper Neurophenomenology as a Remedy for the Heart Problem, follows first the kind of Chalmers argument that experience is not an explanatory posit, but an explanandum in its own right, and it is not a candidate for reductive elimination. Some extra ingredient is necessary to account for how and why experience arises from the workings of the brain. What is needed is a non-reductive explanation. Varela agrees up to now, but he proposes a remedy rather than a form of ontological solution. His special ingredient is not something extra that Chalmers calls for. So what he points out to is the problem with the heart problem. There is standard assumption, a set of physical objects considered pre-existent and real. How does conscious experience arise from that? The neurophenomenology considers this standard formulation of the problem to be the true reason for the existence of it. So instead of offering a solution, Varela offers us a way to dissolve it. The dissolution of the hard problem of conscious experience is found in a certain stance, a way of being, a state of being, a research program wherein the problem vanishes. Instead of finding extra ingredients to account for how consciousness emerges from matter and brain, my proposal reframes the questions to that of finding meaningful bridges between two irreducible phenomenal domains. Italics is mine here, so the irreducible phenomenal domains is the key here. What she's talking about is those are two modes of experiencing the appearances in our conscious awareness that we reify into abstract ontologies, such as mental and physical. Now, there are many common misunderstandings of the real position that you see in the philosophy of mind. So to kind of to put them all together, these two reducible phenomenal domains often get misinterpreted as his position being that of property dualism or dual aspect theory or identity theory, non-reductive physicalism or panpsychism. His statement, putting experience like a guiding thread to where we start and where we must link back, is often thought of as an idealist position. But it's not any form of non-reductionism or monism. It adopts no alternative metaphysical option. Varela's remedies echoes Wittgenstein's treatment of philosophical illness. A treatment is a procedure, a shift in perspective, an experiential rotation that reveals the incorrect presuppositions giving rise to a perceived problem, and thus bypasses the problem altogether. It engages with a metaphysical problem from the standpoint of an experiential stance, starting with the lived experience, sort of the Husserlian dictum back to the things themselves, meaning back to our lived experience of how things appear to us. The shift in perspective reveals that there isn't anything like a problem to be solved, but it needs to be applied consistently, and if it does, it cures any temptation to look for some theoretical fix that would solve the hard problem. Sounds simple enough, but why is it so difficult to apply? And Husserl himself, after writing quite a bit on sort of applicating logical reduction as ways to bypass our naive attitude, in order to bracket out all the presuppositions of reality and experience consciousness without our usual judgments and assumptions about what it is that presents to us and how it presents to us. So this is addressed in the embodied mind, and I quote, "We need to ask ourselves why the idea of worlds with forgiving features or ready-made information seems to be unquestionable. Why are we unable to imagine giving up this idea without falling into some sort of subjectivism, idealism, or cognitive nihilism?" And they answer it by bringing the notion of Cartesian anxiety, which is best put as a dilemma. Either we have a fixed and stable foundation for knowledge, a point where knowledge starts, is grounded and rests, or we cannot escape some sort of darkness, chaos, and confusion. Either there is an absolute ground or foundation, or everything falls apart. We have very low tolerance for sitting with the question. We're sitting with the unknown. Instead of staying with the question, we immediately fall for an answer, however problematic. As a remedy for Cartesian anxiety, Varela and his colleagues prescribe the practice of groundlessness, a state of being free of any reification whatsoever. In the embodied mind, groundlessness is argued from the Majamica's point of view, so this middle way, very simply, if not simplistically put, phenomena, whether mental or physical, in appearance lack inherent and independent existence. But it's not mind-only school, right? It's not idealist. It works the middle way between the notions of existence and non-existence, which in themselves viewed as a reification of our experience of things. So it's not only a conceptual doctrine, it implies finding that, realizing that in our way of being. It's a subtle experiential shift, which is not difficult to glimpse. It can be done at any time, but it's challenging to sustain due to the persistent habit of reifying self and other perceptual structure into the subject and object as a separate, independent, existing entities. A practice of neurophenomenology as a scientist requires utter commitment to remembering at all times that third-person knowledge is none other than a lived experiential manifestation. It is intersubjectively objectified, not objective. The only weakness of the relative position is our weakness. Not everyone is ready to perform, or sometimes even consider, the existential mutation that it requires. To swallow the relative pill wholeheartedly requires deep personal commitment to the transformation of one's conscious experience away from naive attitude, and its application to all life, including scientific pursuits. To quote from Erwin Schrödinger, "The world is given to me only once, not one existing and one perceived. Subject and object are only one. The barrier between them cannot be said to have been broken down as a result of recent experience in physical sciences, for this barrier does not exist." So I'm moving now to giving you a few samplings from contemplative neuroscience research, which really has accelerated recently, so really just a few representative examples to show you how the brain dynamics change when we study people who can realize or can adopt this experiential stance of groundlessness and rest in it, at least for a few minutes at a time, whilst we're scanning them with fMRI, which is, if you've ever been in that environment, you're lying down, it's incredibly noisy, so any subtle practice results get wiped out very quickly. So it's a big challenge. But before I start, a very, very brief and broad brushing up on the main large-scale brain dynamics. And this is from Fox et al. Paper that did a meta-analysis of all the neuroimaging studies, fMRI studies at that point, that used any sort of cognitive task, working memory, attention, executive function type tasks, and used so-called rest. So when you put people in a scale and you give them the task and you have periods of time interleaved with the task, when the participant is asked to do nothing and just presented with a fixation course in front of them. Well, when you tell a person in the scanner to do nothing, it's very difficult to imagine that nothing will be happening in their mind. So what they found is that when you contrast, fMRI is a relative measure, right? So we always look at what is active more as compared to something else. So this rest periods are used as a comparison baseline to the cognitive tasks. So when you look what happens during that rest, regardless of the task performed, there is the same network that was coming up, and it became known as a default mode network. It's located medially in the brain, so this is medial prefrontal cortex and this is posterior cingulate. And the areas in yellow and red are the areas that are associated with they call task positive, so they activate when we engage in some kind of cognitive processing when we pay attention to external stimuli. So they hugely overlap with the right hemisphere located attentional networks. And we have things like frontal eye fields there, superior parietal lobule, etc. And those networks are anti-correlated. When one goes up, the other tends to go down. But in psychopathological conditions, that doesn't often happen. So, first study I wanted to mention to you is the study of healthy people who were scanned before and after 8 weeks, only 8 weeks, of mindfulness-based stress reduction. It's a program developed by John Kabat-Zinn and widely used these days. It's derived from kind of Buddhist practice of mindfulness. And mindfulness, very simply, engages that experiential rotation where we no longer identify with the content of our experience, but we simply aware of it without identification, without grasping, conceptual elaboration, or judging it as likable or dislikable. So these people were scanned before and after the MBSR and were compared with the healthy controls only before the intervention of the program. And what the researchers asked them to do, they gave them adjectives. They were presented with adjectives on the screen, which had personality characteristics such as jealous, stressed, relaxed, generous. And in the narrative condition, and narrative self-reference is this idea of self that we have, which is we consider to be independent, and it's our identity stretching from past to present to future. And in the narrative condition, they were told just allow yourself to react to these adjectives, evaluate them, do they apply to you as a person or not. And the experiential or mindful condition, they were told, well, just look at the same adjectives, but now just simply be mindfully aware of any thoughts, emotions, and sensations that come up in association with those adjectives without self-referencing them. And what they found is that the default baud network, which is in blue here now, green and blue, was activated when they were essentially asking to self-grasp. But that network was deactivated with the activity shifting towards more lateral parts of the brain when they were asked to just be mindfully aware. So even after 8 weeks, we kind of see a shift in how the brain responds to the same information, but in 2 different ways in which we relate to our experience. Right? So the content does not necessarily change. What changes is how we relate to it, and that has bearing on neural dynamics. Now, this other study is from Richard Davidson lab, and Richard Davidson is kind of the biggest player in the field of contemplative neuroscience. He has access to very experienced practitioners that have literally sort of flown in from, by the directive of Dalai Lama from Dharamsala straight to Wisconsin, Madison. And these are very experienced meditators. So they were asked to do a focus on the breath practice, just to be aware of the breath and sensations in the body associated with the breath. And they were compared with age-matched novices. So novices were given the instructions for the same practice and asked to practice it for about a week before they were scanned. And when those 2 groups were compared, the normal expected result was observed. The attentional networks, so this is the comparison, attentional right lateralized networks were more active in expert meditators. Seems, fair enough. They pay more attention, their attention is more stable, etc.